Well, this morning we are picking up with our study of the 8th chapter of John. And in the larger context of chapters 2 through 12, which is the public demonstration of the signs of the Son, the miracles and key characteristics of his person that cover the majority of his public ministry in John's scenario. We have seen that there is a twofold division. The first, 3 chapters, 2 to 4, show us the period of general reception to Christ, and then starting in chapter 5, when Jesus is down in Jerusalem, we see increased division, increased rejection. And this increased rejection takes place after about a year of Jesus' public ministry. Now, chapter 5 finds Jesus where? In what general vicinity? Chapter 5? Where he defends himself? Yes, he did a miracle in Jerusalem and had to defend himself before the Jews. Where do we find Jesus in chapter 6? Galilee, feeding 5,000 people, going up to Cana and speaking in the actually to Capernaum, speaking in the synagogue, right? Then in chapter 7, where is Jesus again? In Jerusalem. Where is he in chapter 8? Still there. We find in the first verse of the 8th chapter, Jesus went going to the Mount of Olives, and in the last verse of the chapter, it says they took up stones to cast at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. And so from beginning to end in this 8th chapter, we have Jesus in Jerusalem. How did chapter 7 end? How did chapter 7 end?
Christ was trying to defend himself, but the Jewish leaders that he's striking stood by.
All right. Ultimately, the Jewish leadership themselves itself was divided. Some of them, Nicodemus seemed to defend Christ, and the others seemed to reject him. The officers that they had sent to arrest Christ were divided. They certainly weren't going to arrest the man that they were convinced was unique, special. The people were divided. And so the 7th chapter shows us the more decisive break among the populace in the views concerning Christ. What did we say the theme of chapter 7 was? The sign of the unknown prophet, right? Knowable but unknown. Jesus said, you don't know me. You don't know where I came from. You don't know what I'm doing here. You don't know where I'm going. You won't know. You should know, Jesus said. If you will, you will know. If you have the desire, you would know. All right? Now, I think that chapter 8 seems to be an extension of the same issues that are raised in chapter 7. We have the same protagonists. What's a protagonist? Pardon? The main characters, right? So it's Jesus, Jews, in the presence of his disciples, right? You have the same spirit of opposition. Do you know anything about chapter 8 in John? What's the main episode that the 8th chapter begins with? All right, we have the scribes and the Pharisees bringing to Jesus a woman caught in the act of adultery. and they're challenging Jesus. And in verse 12, it seems after the episode is concluded, Jesus still is speaking, apparently in the temple. And it's the Pharisees listening. So we have the same protagonist, the same spirit of opposition by questioning Christ and by challenging him. I believe that the 8th chapter simply draws out and shows the further ramifications of ignorance of the person of Christ. So now for the first time in our study of John, we see more than one chapter being devoted to the same sort of situation. Chapter 8 is really the same thing as chapter 7, and we're going to treat it like that. So if John chapter 7 shows Christ to be the knowable one, or the knowable prophet, then John chapter 8 shows Christ to have become the unknown prophet. And again, as we look at the terminology in this chapter, I think you'll see that the same words that were key in the 7th chapter are essentially the same keys of the 8th chapter. Look at some of the key words that are found in the book. There's heavy emphasis on at least 5 themes in this 8th chapter. Teaching, the teaching of Christ. 3 times there is reference to the word taught, that Jesus taught. 6 times to Jesus bearing witness. 1 time to his testimony, 10 times to his word. 4 references to the things that he was saying. 10 references to the truth in this chapter. That's quite an emphasis in this 8th chapter, is the truth. 1 reference to his sayings. So if you add all those up, we have what? 9, 10, 20, 30, 35 references to Christ's teaching in the 8th chapter. Also, Christ makes at least 17 references to his own Father. 12 direct references where he explicitly calls him by name. 5 references to him who sent me. Sometimes they're combined. For example, verse 18, I am one that bear witness of myself, and the Father that sent me beareth witness of me. Sometimes alone. Verse 26, I have many things to say and to judge of you, but he that sent me is true. Right? So we have a number of references, and that doesn't take into account all the personal pronouns that refer to the Father, he and him and so forth. There are at least 15 references in this 8th chapter to sin in its various aspects. The significance of this is seen when we just step for a moment out of this particular time frame and we go forward to the upper room discourse where Jesus was speaking with his disciples the night before he was crucified. And in John chapter 15, Jesus said that the world did not know me. They have opposed me for no good reason. And the reason Jesus gave for their opposition to him was because he exposed their sin. And this is what Jesus is doing here in the 8th chapter. This is the actual, this is when he did it. He exposed their sin. So he refers, there are references to adultery here, their deeds, fornication, lusts, murder and killing, lying. All the way through this 8th chapter, Jesus is exposing the people's sins. There are several references to Christ's judgment. Words like judge and condemn, which occurs 6 times. The word convict show this to be another theme. The the very fact that people were rejecting Christ, that there was a division of opinion about him, shows that the people were in the process of forming a judgment regarding his person, right? Well, Jesus himself, in turn, is sitting in judgment on the sinners. We find sort of like a polarizing effect here. Last but not least, in fact, this is what I consider to be the primary theme of the 8th and 7th chapters, is the reference to knowing and not knowing. Knowing and not knowing. We've already mentioned that in the 7th chapter, this theme was raised about 15 times. In the 8th chapter, it's repeated another 17 times. But the emphasis is on the lack of knowing. Let me just read you these references. John chapter 8, verse 14. Jesus answered and said unto them, Though I bear witness of myself, yet my witness is true, for I know from where I came and where I go, but ye cannot tell. And that word tell is the Greek word oida. You do not know. See? From where I come and where I go. Verse 19. Then said they unto him, Where is my Father? Jesus answered, Ye neither know me nor my Father. If ye had known me, ye should have known my Father. All three references to knowledge in that verse are oida, to have a general perception, have a general idea, theoretical, just a mental perception. Verse 27, as a result of Jesus' preaching, John comments. He says the people did not understand that he spoke to them of the Father. That's gnosko. They had no real perception. Verse 28, Then said Jesus unto them, When ye have lifted up the Son of Man, then shall ye know that I am he, and that I do nothing of myself, but as my Father hath taught me, I speak these things. So Jesus was predicting that in the future there was going to come a time when they really would know by experience the things that he was speaking, the claiming regarding his relationship to his Heavenly Father, implying that at the present they lacked this knowledge. Verse 32, Jesus said, Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Gnosko again, deep experiential knowledge. Verse 37, Jesus said, I know that you are Abraham's seed. Contrast here between Jesus' knowledge and their lack of it. Verse 43, Why do you not understand my speech? The answer, even because ye cannot hear my word. Not understand is gnosko. See? Jesus is saying, hey, you people don't really have any clue here. You don't have a deep understanding. Verse 52, the claims of the Jews was that we know, speaking to Jesus, that you have a demon. I mean, they were absolutely convinced. They used the word gnosko here in the, claiming their own perception, depth of perception. They claimed to have a deep, abiding knowledge that Jesus is really just a demon-possessed preacher. Verse 55, Jesus' analysis of that claim was that ye have not known him, that is the Father, gnosko, ye have not come to know him by experience, but I know him. Jesus, in the rest of the verse, uses oida. That is, I know all about him, and if I should say I do not know him, I shall be a liar like unto you, but I know him and keep his saying. So here are the references to knowledge or lack of it in the 8th chapter, which continues to stress the same reaction to the claims of Christ as we saw in chapter 7. Now I'll give you an assignment for next class. I want you to identify the references to knowledge in the 9th chapter, or lack of it. Okay? I believe that chapter 9 simply is an extension of chapters 7 and 8. I believe chapters 7, 8, and 9 all occur at the same immediate time frame, because chapter 9 begins with the phrase, and as Jesus passed by. Passed by from where? Where was he going from at the end of chapter 8? He's not leaving Jerusalem, he's going out of the temple. And it says, and so he passed by, and the first verse of the next chapter says, and as he passed by, he saw a blind man. And the same protagonist, we find the Pharisees involved in verse 13. And I really believe that what we have in chapter 7, 8, and 9 really the same day's events. Okay? Now, you may it's hard to conceive that you can have 3 verses of narrative and record in the book of John that cover eons of time. A couple of verses in chapter 1 that refer to, many years of Christ's life, and then 3 chapters that devoted to one day. But that's just the way it is, right? And the reason it's like that is because the author is putting his own emphasis. He's selecting events are sort of like on the arbitrary basis in his own mind, that he's finding signs concerning the Son, and these are very significant. This has got to be an extraordinarily significant day in the experience of Jesus Christ, because on this particular day, so much fell into place, sort of. That's, I believe, how you're supposed to look at the significance of chapter 7, 8, and 9. What?
Did you want us to just find knowledge?
Yes, I want you to list the words that refer to knowledge in chapter 9, or the verses, and I also want you to outline it. Outline the chapter. Okay? So I want you to do the chronological and biographical and geographical references. Okay? I want to see that. I don't want you just to give me a sheet of paper with 3 lines on it. What I want to see is the data behind your finished outline. I want a finished outline for chapter 9 that I can see where you have correlated your geographical references and your biographical references and your chronological references for that chapter. That's for next week. Now today we want to try to cover this 8th chapter. We've given you the topical themes of chapter 8. Let's quickly just run through the story found in chapter 8. Geographically, where do we find Jesus in this 8th chapter? Okay, I've already given you the first and last reference. Let's fill it out geographically. He starts where? In chapter 8, verse 1. The Mount of Olives is actually outside of the east of the city of Jerusalem. Okay? Right? And when is this taking place? I didn't ask you that, but Okay, so Jesus is in the Mount of Olives early in the morning. Verse 2 tells us, gives us an advance in this information. Well, people, this is not difficult. This is just reading. I'm asking you to, okay, so he goes from the Mount of Olives into the temple, right? Visualize that. He goes down, down into the deep rift of the Kidron Valley, comes up, and he goes into the temple, probably through the eastern gate, which has been walled up for centuries now, all right? So he comes into the temple, right? Now how long does that last? Scan through it there. Where does Jesus remain in the temple? Okay, I think it goes right to the end of the chapter. However, there is one significant verse. These words, verse 20, spoke Jesus in the treasury as he taught in the temple. Now we know that when Jesus early in the morning came into the temple that he sat down and he taught the people. Well, here a little more specific reference that he sat particularly in the treasury. Does anybody know where the treasury part of the temple is? You know anything about the temple plan? Well, the temple was divided into sectors. Who were the only people allowed into the Holy of Holies? Only the high priest, once a year. Who could go into the holy place? The priests themselves. They could go into the holy place. They could bring the showbread in and light the candles and stuff like that, right? Then what was outside of the holy place? Right? You have the court of the Jewish males. Only Jewish males who are purified could go into that court, closer to the Lord. Then outside of that you have court of the Gentiles and of the women. Right? So this was sort of the area that just anybody could go into. Anybody could go into this outside. It was a large area. Right? The temple compound is a very large area. Right? Can't tell you exactly. I think it was the size of a couple football fields. Like it was a pretty big area overall. Right? The northeast and the south sections of the perimeter of the court of the women and the Gentiles was a great big wall, huge wall that was supported by pillars, right? And in the spaced out appropriately all around this, under these colonnades, sort of like a roof under it, and people could go under there in the weather and so forth. There were spaced 13 trumpet-shaped brass containers in which that were called the like that's where they threw their money. They put their money in. Okay, collections for the rebuilding and the maintenance of the temple. Right. And so this is where Jesus was sitting. He was sitting in the vicinity of these, in this area, probably sitting under the colonnades there in the court of the women. Right. So the majority of the 8th chapter then takes place right there in the court of the women. Okay? And the hustle and the bustle of the crowd. And then at the last part of verse 59 at the end of the chapter, it says that he left the temple and passed by. Okay, so we've seen the story. Starts on the Mount of Olives, then moves into the temple, and then moves out of the temple. Biographically, let's talk about the people. If you take these same 3 divisions, who is on the Mount of Olives? Anyone else? Possibly. Right? At least Jesus. When he comes into the temple, who's there? All the people, verse 2. Verse 3. right? Scribes, Pharisees, and the woman. Now that particular situation proceeds down through a ways, probably verse 11, because it says eventually that the who left. Verse 9, all the men, all these accusers of the woman left, and Jesus was standing there alone with the woman, John says in verse 9. They must have come back because in verse 13 we find Pharisees there. Right? Verse 14, Jesus is talking to the Pharisees. He's defending himself again. Verse 19, the Pharisees are still speaking to him, challenging him. Jesus is answering. Okay? Apparently he was surrounded by a fairly hostile crowd. Verse 22 calls them the Jews. Okay? Now pick out a few more developments here. Are there any other types of individuals isolated as the day wore on here? What happened? I didn't hear you. Yeah, but there were developments in this scenario. If you were doing a movie, you could actually make 2 or 3 scenes in this act. If verses 2 to 59a represent the main act of the play, you have several sub-themes. Right? What developed? First you have sort of like a confrontation. Jesus is defending himself, and then what happens? Where are you? Okay. We've already gone past that.
What chapter are you in?
We have been in 8.
Verse 59.
I'm saying that in verses 2 through 59a, the bulk of this chapter, Jesus is in the temple. We've already seen that. But I mean, while he was there speaking, there were several little movements taking place. Okay. Yes, first you have a confrontation. Jesus sort of defending himself with the Pharisees. That sort of petered out. And the next thing you read in verses 27, 28, 29, 30, you have some of those listeners professing to believe in Jesus Christ. And so Jesus then is beginning to speak to them specifically. You see that? Some of the Jews believed, and so Jesus spoke to them about discipleship. Well, this developed into a hairy situation. What happened out of this? These people that allegedly believed in Jesus Christ, this is the way I read it, that the pronouns in this ensuing section, down to verses 39, 40 to 44, that area, if you follow the pronouns through specifically, it leads you back to the Jews who believed. Now this raises an interesting question. There's 2 ways to interpret this 8th chapter, this section. Either these people were merely professing disciples, professing believers, and they really didn't believe because, they ended up rejecting what Jesus was actually teaching them. You follow? Jesus was saying, you people don't believe. You don't understand, verse 43. He said, you people of your father the devil. Is that the way Jesus would normally describe a believer? You understand what I'm saying? Like, either these people were false believers professing adherence to him, or maybe there were a few believers and the disbelievers were people in the crowd that they're not really identified. I can't really solve that, but I've always interpreted it to be situation number 1, that these people said they believed, and so Jesus tried to disciplize them, and they started to resist his teaching, and in effect Jesus was saying, you really don't believe. Okay? How did the episode in the temple end? What was the final development? Yeah, they tried to kill him. I believe this situation with these professing disciples degenerated quickly. It just became hotter and hotter and hotter, and finally it just climaxed with an attempt on his life, right? When he claimed to be the I am of Exodus chapter 3. So we have 4 clear subdivisions in the 8th chapter. This is what you have to do, people, when you're analyzing the chapter. I've given you an assignment for next week to analyze chapter 9, right? Now, part of it you will be able to do by looking at the chronological references to time. You may find that there are movements, physical movements that take, you have Jesus in one place and then he's in another place and another place. But you cannot afford to overlook the logic, what the story is actually saying, right? Even if Jesus is in the same place with the same people, you may have 2 separate events. Follow? You have to pay attention to what is being written, the subject matter, besides these other useful analytical approaches, right? So what are the 4 major subdivisions then of chapter 8? Let's make a note of them on the board. Get references for me. What are the first one? What's the first one? Okay, 1 to 12. Okay, the episode regarding the woman, Jesus and the woman, and the Jews. Okay, this probably was in the same area as all the teaching took place. I believe he was in the treasury, because he sat down and taught the people. And it says down in verse 20 that this is where he taught the people. He was in the treasury. But that was episode number 1. What ensued? Starting verse 13, and I don't know how far would you take this next development. What is the next development?
Seems to be a little bit of break.
Okay, 20. I believe that 13 to 20 probably takes us through this. What is actually happening? Immediately after these guys left Jesus, what happened? Yeah, Jesus was challenged by Pharisees. Okay, he had to defend himself. So we have a defense. Okay, so starting in 21 and following, what ensued? Okay, speaking to Jewish people, what eventually happened with this, out of this teaching? Okay, so he got some converts, or professed converts. So Jesus with, we'll put professed believers. And where does it say they believed? Okay, so if this section then is Jesus' teaching that results in some people professing belief, well, that's sort of like a new segment, right? It's a new development in the relationship for the day. Then starting at 31, he's speaking to these people, and what eventually happens out of this? He's rejected by these professing believers, right? And that takes us right to 58, right, or 59a. Okay, so Jesus eventually rejected by these professing believers. Now, even if the other scenario that I mentioned about these believers is possible, it really doesn't make a whole lot of difference. Right. Now, do you see any difference between these? If you were going to group these and make an overall outline, we've got the basic divisions of the chapter here. Perhaps we should make this 2 to 12, because verse 1, oh my goodness, this chalk. verse 1 is giving us background, and verse 59b is giving us subsequent background. So is there any way you could group any of these 4 subdivisions?
First 2 sections be Pharisees.
Okay, I'm not sure if the Pharisees are specifically mentioned. It doesn't look like they are. I never really noticed that. It's quite likely, however, that the Pharisees were still in the crowd in the remainder of the day. I mean, nothing really has happened.
But it doesn't really, it says in the first few verses, it says yes.
Yes, it specifically identifies the Pharisees in the first 2 divisions. Okay, so you might, I don't know how else you would divide that if you made that one division, just based on the Pharisees. Jesus with the Pharisees and Jesus with the Jews? Okay. What essentially is Jesus doing in each of these? Do any of these share essentially the same information about actually what Jesus is doing? If you had to use one word to describe what Jesus is doing in each of these sections, what is he doing in this first section? Defending the woman, right? What is he doing here? All right? What's he doing here? Teaching. Basically just teaching. Right? But it says in verse 13 to 20 that he was teaching. It says that when he was sitting in the temple or when he was confronted with the woman that he was teaching there too. So you could say that basically Jesus is teaching all the way through this chapter. Right? The whole thing is teaching. Right? In my outline, which I'll give to you today that we'll be using for our study, I made the division there. In the first 11 verses, I didn't think maybe the first 11 verses is where the break should be. In the first 11 verses, we have a confrontation and a test. In verses 12 to 59, we have conversations and testimony. Now this, certainly there's a certain amount of confrontation in this section right here between Jesus and the Pharisees. There's no doubt about that. Right? This is a little more overt confrontation, right? That they actually brought up a physical confrontation, right? With a protagonist that is not apparently there in the remainder of the chapter. So this one revolves around the woman. By the way, there's a textual problem here in the 8th chapter. I should mention it before we leave it, because it has a bearing on how you're going to treat this. In some manuscripts, the first 11 verses of chapter 8 and the last verse of chapter 7 are completely missing. All right? In other words, in some manuscripts, chapter 8 simply starts here at verse 12. Okay? Now, do you see any fundamental reasons or descriptions that would suggest that the first 11 verses really don't fit in John chapter 8? Or does it seem to even fit topically, the theme, the way people are responding to Jesus Christ? Does it fit the times? We find Jesus eventually, an attempt being made on his life at the end of chapter 8. Just before that, there's a serious confrontation with these professed believers. We have Jesus teaching, and apparently some people believing in him or professing belief. But prior to that, he was being challenged by the Pharisees to defend himself. Right? Do you think that this episode of the woman is situated well or badly, as we find it in our Bibles? Why? Why would you say well?
Great following, he has another confrontation with the Pharisee.
Okay, so basically the episode at issue is a confrontation, and it's followed by a confrontation. It seems to fit. What about protagonist? Is it a story that seems to be unrelated totally, or is it related closely? Could it be related closely in terms of what was actually happening? The people and the place and the time. You don't see why it wouldn't be related? Well, you can be more specific.
I see there's another way. The Pharisees are trying to find fault.
It actually mentions Pharisees, as you pointed out, in the first 11 verses. And it says in verses 12 to 20, the second division of the chapter, that it's the Pharisees that confronted Christ. So, I mean, it's the very same people that were opposing Christ. Where is Jesus in the first event? It says he comes from the Mount of Olives into the temple. Where is Jesus in verses 12 to 20? Teaching in the temple. So, as far as I'm concerned, I think that the very nature of the situation proves that this is actually canonical. You know, it is part of the canon. It's, you know, it fits perfectly. There isn't a thing that in the first 11 verses and the last verse of chapter 7 that seems strange or that seems contradictory or anachronistic, you know, out of time, out of place. Okay? I can't see how there's any problem. In fact, it complements it well. So just be aware that the first 11 verses are sometimes taken and put at the end of chapter 8 in some manuscripts. Okay? Now, having said that, let's start working our way through. Actually, we have only made 3 divisions from 12 to 59. Actually, from 21 to 30, there are actually 2 conversations. So if you're going to break the chapter down into its logical developments, there is a clear break at verse 27. So we have a conversation in verses 12 to 20. We have another conversation in 21 to 27. We have another conversation in 28 to 30. And the largest of the conversations in the chapter is in 31 to 59. There's one thing I meant to talk about before we got into it, so we should just back up for a moment. What is the contextual approach? Contextual. We have called it the contextual approach. What is that? It's one of the 10 approaches we use to analyze Scripture. We haven't used it much. Well, I can understand how you'd say that, because that's context goes through a passage. What did we call contextual approach? Yeah, looking for contrasts specifically within a context, right? So John 8 is our